Welcome to Crafting Legends, the show where for 15 weeks we're celebrating the 15th anniversary of Minecraft with some of the people who shaped the game into what we know it as today. I'm your host, Matthew Hiddleston, and this is episode 1. Today I'm joined by Rufus10.
Hello, I'm Rufus10. I'm one of the admins of Omni Archive, and I'm joining just for this first episode. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. We're very glad to have you.
It's all right. I'm excited to talk about all of the things for this intro.
This first episode is going to be a crash course in Minecraft history, with some fun facts and debunked myths along the way. This is because that in the next ensuing episodes, we're going to be going a bit more in depth. So it's important for everyone to have the ground rules and basics understood before we move on to the more deep-end stuff. This is obviously the first episode, so we really want to hear feedback on how we do and any ideas for future episodes. And with that, let's get into a bit more of who we are and why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So we are the Omni Archive. You might not have heard of us. We generally work a bit more in the background. But what we do is basically try to track down as much of Minecraft's history as we can before it gets lost due to the way the internet tends to forget things, or even after it's been lost and trying to track down anyone who might still have it on their hard drives and such. We have been quite successful. We have found how many versions, Rufus?
At this point, I think it's at least 90 plus. And that's just like older versions, so pre-release 1.0, so pre-2011. Yeah, so quite a lot. We've existed since 2017, so wow, 6 years now. Yeah, September 2017.
Yeah, coming up on 7 in September, and I myself have been a part of the Omni Archive since August of 2020. So I know you've been here quite a bit longer than I have, but I'm glad to have been a part of this journey myself.
Yeah, you've been an important part of it, really. So
we are all about trying to preserve as much as we can. There are certain versions, even from 2010, that we might never find because they were out for such a short period of time, but we do try. We should probably just sort of jump right in. We're going to be starting from the beginning, the very beginning, although, as I said, we're not going to be going into too much detail here, just starting off easy. So, first of all, one of the most common questions / comments that we get is, why exactly are you doing what you do, trying to archive all these versions, when obviously the launcher has every version? Well, the first thing to debunk is that, no, the launcher does not actually have every version. It has a lot of versions, but if you look, just for instance, you'll see that it only has one Infdev version, and there were many, many, many Infdev versions, and it has 0 indev versions. Yeah.
I think we have around 25 Infdev versions, for example, So.
Yeah, so we've, really added on that front, and as for the indevs, it had none at the time. To this day, they still haven't added them, even though we've found these various indevs. That's their decision, but for us at least, it's very nice to be able to not be limited by that assortment. And so that's really the impetus for why we started, is just to add to what we were given there. We were at least very grateful that there were certain versions in the launcher that we would have never had a chance to find on our own, such as the early pre-classics, and but we're glad to be able to add to that. So the launcher also frequently does mislabel some versions, such as talk about that some if you would.
So the main example is like the final version of Classic is labeled 0.30_01C, which that final bit is just kind of made up distinction, and really it's just it's a re-upload of 0.30. And then there's other examples like the launcher claims to have alpha 1.2.1, which is actually a missing version, and in reality the one that is labelled as that is actually the next version, the _01 patch of that. And yeah, I feel like all of that kind of reflects on what the landscape of like old version finding was before big communities existed like this. I remember even when I first joined the server, it was not massive, it still wasn't very well known, and there was still a lot of unknowns at the time. Even like the official wiki had very limited information about old versions and development, and had a lot of wrong information as well. Like you might remember, a lot of the development versions, like for example for survival tests, were considered to have been released, and there was like pages for all of those versions, when in reality none of those were released, and anyone who did proper research would have realized that, but no one had really looked into it properly, which is a massive contrast to now, where we have like all of the information really, and we have like exact release times for almost every version ever released, like down to the minute, from, for example, like IRC logs and other sources of information that have been acquired in recent years that have like massively made that a lot more clearer what actually happened. Yeah, so I feel like that was what really brought me to the community in the first place, was the mystery of it, which I guess has kind of been demystified now, but it's still very interesting to me, like all the changes that have occurred to make Minecraft into the game it is today. And like that early community is very different to what we see today. And I think that a lot of people mischaracterized that when they talk about the history of the game. Like, people tend to forget that it wasn't this big phenomenon when it started. It was a random indie game in a Java applet. It wasn't, and that was how people treated it. They didn't treat it as this big thing up until really like late 2010, I would say, is when it really started to be taken seriously and actually have a proper player base. So yeah, it's a very different like landscape to what we see today, where like early on it was like the community was really spread over like a few forums and some influence from 4chan as well, which yeah is a big thing in itself.
I should say one of the main drivers for Omniarchive to actually be formed was this collection of versions that really brought everything together that people had been finding up to that point, including launcher versions and versions that people had just sort of been able to keep on their own and make public. And this was a collection done by Luigi 2600, and it was posted online in 2016, and it sort of gained a lot of popularity, at least amongst people who were interested in retro Minecraft at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really sort of what started y'all on your journey initially, you know, once you realized that there was this push to be able to get all these things together.
Yeah, so I actually know from having spoken to half of a kebab, Lewis, before a few years ago, that he became interested in old versions and like archival from, I think it was a video made by Ant Venom about Luigi's versions specifically. And then obviously they quickly discovered that those versions consisted of quite a lot of fake versions or just like slightly edited, which I think really led to him trying to create a community which focused on like the truth and the reality of the situation. But it's kind of interesting how that collection that wasn't necessarily in hindsight, we now see it as probably not a great thing, actually led to the community that we have today. Yeah, so before that, there were some efforts to archive old versions of the game. Particularly one was in 2010, when someone named Zariki tried to make a collection known as Retrograph, which was actually taken down by Notch, or on the request of Notch, I think it was around June 2010, and that had quite a lot of versions. That in fact, some of them ended up then being not seen again until we came around and contacted Zariki. So even though that happened, like, you'd think those versions would have stayed around online, but a lot of them didn't, even though they were available at one time. But yeah, so in that time, in the time between 2009 and 2017, there were odd versions that people would find on their old computers or whatever, or they'd kept around and they would release them online. I know specifically 0.0.13a_03 was available from very early on. I think 2010, and that kind of floated around on the internet, and a few indev versions, a couple of Infdev versions. But like overall, the amount available was nothing compared to like what we have now. And obviously, like that this was even before the versions were added into the launcher, which was 2013, when quite a lot were added into the launcher. And even the ones in the launcher actually seem to originate from a program known as MC Nostalgia, I believe it's called, which used a patch system to allow you to play older versions, and all of the alphas that are in the launcher are the same ones that were available in MC Nostalgia. So that kind of indicates like which ones were available at the time, yeah.
I think now that we've laid down the groundwork for exactly why we're doing what we're doing, let's
why we're doing it, yeah.
Get into the nitty-gritty, at least in a broad overview sense, of exactly how Minecraft started and how it got to its final state that it is today, and, well, maybe even look towards the future a little bit. So, the beginning of the game. Well, it's a little bit nebulous, because obviously Notch did start, making games long before Minecraft, and there were a few games in particular that he had made prior to Minecraft, and some made by other people that he took inspiration from that are worth talking about a little bit here. One of the most famous would be Rubydung. Now, some people try to say that Rubydung was basically Minecraft, but in its earliest state, or that conversely Minecraft was just a more developed version of Rubydung. It's not quite right.
Yeah.
To give an example, Valve reused pretty much, like, I don't know exactly what percentage, but a large amount of code from Half-Life 2 for their game Team Fortress 2. By the way, Team Fortress 2 has a bit of a story to play in Minecraft's history, but we'll get into that later. But Team Fortress 2 is not a continuation of Half-Life 2. It just reuses some code. And likewise, Rubydung, while, yes, early versions of Minecraft were labeled, the very, very earliest builds, I should say, as Rubydung, it was more like it was some code reused from Rubydung, and also some assets reused from Rubydung, but the games themselves were quite different. To give a big example, Rubydung was isometric, and that means that basically instead of being a first-person view, you were seeing the world from sort of a 45-degree angle, looking on it as sort of a, kind of like a landscape in the distance. And it had certain textures, though, that would be recognizable, even though it wasn't really developed very much, because development was ceased on that to move on to Minecraft. But the textures of cobblestone and very early textures of grass were there. But again, the game itself would have been quite different. Other games to note would be games like Zombie Town, which we don't really know much about, but Notch did release a video on his channel.
Yeah, so that was more of a tech demo.
Yeah, talk about that.
So I think that was based on GTA Chinatown, if I'm correct. Yeah, so it actually has what was later used for the Steve human texture, which is where that originates from. I believe that tech demo comes from early 2009 as well. Same as Rubydung. Rubydung comes from, I believe, February 2009. And it was also kind of a tech demo testing like isometric. But it's worth noting also that Notch had developed somewhat similar engines and like prototypes before that we now know more about, which will be covered in a further episode as well.
Another famous example of inspiration was a game not made by Notch, but which he, if you look at it, obviously was inspired by, is Infiniminer. Came out in earlier 2009 and featured basically the same fundamental gameplay, a first-person voxel-based game where you place and remove blocks, although the actual game modes ended up being put on top of that were different than what Minecraft started out with. Infiniminer wasn't as much about building, it was more just... I explained it. I think it was a bit more of like a combat sort of based game / running away from lava.
Yeah, so it's worth noting, I believe the reason why kind of all of this ended up happening the way it did is Infiniminer, yeah, really, I think it released early 2009. And then at some point, the source code for the game was leaked, which led to the developer discontinuing like development of it. And you're right, what happened was, like, it was, I believe it was like, yeah, sort of like what it would now be like the lava survival type of game mode in like Classic, where people would run away. And I think there was also some element of like two teams fighting against each other. But then people ended up enjoying the building aspect of it more. And that is what led to Notch making the initial prototype for Minecraft cave game, which he even says himself openly on the first video is a Infiniminer clone. In reality, it's like a bit more complex than that, I would say. Like, a lot of people try to claim that it was entirely based on Infiniminer, but if you look at the what things Notch had made before, it almost feels like he was kind of leading up to making a game like this, and then he saw Infiniminer and was like, this is what I want to make. So it was a direct inspiration, but also it also seems like he had similar ideas beforehand, and that just allowed him to make the final product, I guess. Yeah.
So it was perhaps inspiration, but also showing him that something like this can be successful. That
yes.
It's not just him coming up with this.
I feel like probably the idea of like it being a building thing probably came from that, but that is also from like Dwarf Fortress and other similar games as well, was inspired.
We also don't exactly know when Minecraft started development, which sounds a bit strange when you say it, because it's one of the, if not, I believe at this point, the most purchased game in the world. You'd think we'd know this sort of thing, but we know that development started somewhere around May 10th, May 11th, but it's hard to say exactly when. Rufus might explain why exactly it's a bit difficult.
Yeah, so 2009, May 2009, we know as far as most people are concerned, the first video and the first real like evidence to like a lot of people would be the cave game video, which is May 13th, 2009. But in reality, we do know a bit more than that. There are IRC logs out there from early May 2009, I believe the TIG IRC log, TIG source forum, IRC chat room, and that we have logs from that, and it shows at least mentions of what would become Minecraft by Notch on, I believe the earliest evidence we have is like May 12th, but it was likely that he'd been doing it by at least 1 or 2 days by that point. So you can estimate probably May 10th or 11th, but there's no certainty. And I think actually people do tend to say May 10th, but I think that comes from the fact that later on in 2009, Notch claimed that it began on May 10th, but that was like 6 months later. So it's entirely possible that he was not correct about that, because like obviously memory is fallible. Like he could have just looked back at his timeline and thought it was around then, but not actually been sure about it, because he didn't even really seem sure about it even only months later. So yeah, as you said, Minecraft is obviously now the number one best-selling game of all time. Sold 300 million units roughly, I think.
Yeah. And more than Tetris, and I know that was number one for a long time.
Yeah.
Of course, the shared in between is blocks. So if you want to make a lot of money, just put blocks in your game.
Make a block. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Between the time that Minecraft started, whenever exactly that was, between the time it was actually first made public, May 17th, 2009, is roughly about 5-6 days. Let's talk about some of the things that were going on during those 5-6 days.
Yeah, so in that time, so obviously the first thing that was shown to people was the cave game tech test on May the 13th, 2009. And we also know that Notch showed builds of it and actually probably shared them with his girlfriend at the time, Easy. And then from then onwards, there were more images shown on his Tumblr page up until then May 16th, which is when the first versions that were shared with anyone else other than Notch and Easy, which were shared privately in the IRC channel. I believe it might have even been under a private channel, and then initially, and then later on it was just shared publicly in the IRC chat. And that was then eventually led to the first public release of which is 11a, 0.0.11a on May 17th, 2009.
Oddly enough, for a while people thought that the first build of Minecraft, the first build that, anybody but Notch had touched, was a version from the day before the public release, which was 0.0.9a.
Yeah.
That's because that was the earliest version that anybody was able to track down screenshots of back then from anyone but Notch. And for a long time, it was just assumed, well, I guess that's the first build that was actually put out to anybody. But there were actually several builds put out before then. One of the earliest was 0.0.2a. I don't actually know. You might know. Was that the first version that was actually put out into one of these IRCs? Were there any earlier ones?
There were earlier ones, not many. We obviously only know them. They're only attested through IRC logs. We don't have any images of them, sadly. There actually were images posted at the time, but they've since been lost. Basically because of the fact that the IRC logs were only found later on, like in the last few years, and by that time the images had unfortunately gone down. So I know for a fact there was at some point an image of 0.0.2a. So yeah, that is the reason why people then assumed that, because the first version they could find evidence of was 0.0.9a, other than the ones that Notch had, which obviously were development builds. But we now know that's not the case. The ones before 0.0.2a didn't have any like version label. So we know that was roughly when the version label was added. There's like a bit of controversy over whether there was one named 0.0.1a or not. We don't really know whether or not there was, because there's not any evidence for a version release at that time, but it would kind of make sense for there to have been one. Yeah, so that's a whole thing in itself.
Well, that sort of relates to something we'll be bringing up in more detail later in the series.
Yeah.
Versions of the game that we're not even sure existed, but are at least fun to speculate about and try to find information about. And we certainly do try. But so, okay, we're on to May 17th. It's 0.0.11a. The game has finally been made public, and on that day, you have people such as people on Indie Games writing an article about it, saying, hey, this is a brand new thing, looks interesting, let's see where it goes. And it already starts to get some videos. You see videos on YouTube of people who came across it and are posting, what all the things they've found, from people like TigSource, and as I said, people who perhaps saw it on Indie Games. And so it starts to already build some traction from there. People, I think, famously are posting screenshots of all the pixel art. Of course, though, at the time, the game was very, very, very simple. You only had a few types of blocks, so any sort of pixel art would have been, well, not exactly pixel perfect. It would have been limited in its color palette, let's say. So the game moves on, and this is also where the archival once again sort of intertwines with the story here, because we don't have, sadly enough, 0.0.11a. And it's something we're desperately trying to correct and have been for a long time. But whether or not we'll ever be successful, I suppose we'll have to see.
Yet to be seen.
To be seen.
Yeah.
But the things going against it would be that it was so early on that very few people relatively played it, and even fewer people would have likely still have the computer or drives from that time to still have it. But that brings us sort of towards our next version that we actually have archived, which is 0.0.12a_03. Now, of course, there were versions in between that and 0.0.11a, but those were, it's basically bug fixes from there. The version we have is already quite different from 0.0.11a, because this version, it has huge lava lakes, which is, there was no lava in 0.0.11a, and it had a sort of different generation, more interesting hilly generation. If you look at screenshots, you'll see that. And also players jumped higher. I don't know why. And another interesting thing that sort of intertwines with the archival is that you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute, you just said that 0.0.11a isn't archived, but I'm looking in the launcher, it's there, isn't it? And I load it up and it says 0.0.11a there. Well, that's the thing, is that that's actually a dev version for 0.0.12a. And Notch, of course, because it was a build, it was a dev version, he didn't really bother to change the version number at that point in the top corner. But if you look at the code, you can see that there was code there from after the original release of 0.0.11a, and you can also see that there's some early multiplayer code, which is very interesting. And of course, we'll get onto that. But he was already working on multiplayer that early on. So, all right, we're at around Open 0.13a now. So we have lava, we have, dirt, stone. We have a few things, but now people can actually start saving worlds. And Open 0.13a starts to allow for that, which is before you just load up a world and have fun. And unless, I believe Rufus perhaps could explain here, but there were ways to save worlds before this point, but it was not easy.
So technically, yes, but I don't think anyone actually did it at the time. So the game actually does have an inbuilt save function before 13a, but it's only possible if you run the game offline. And obviously, as far as I know, no one was really doing that other than Notch himself, probably. And so when you play those versions in the launcher today, like, you can actually save worlds in 0.0.12a_03, whereas people in 2009 actually wouldn't have been able to do that. So once 0.0.13a was released, that allowed online saving, which is how initially everyone saved their worlds. It was saved to Notch's server, and then the game grabs that world from the server, and you had 5 slots.
Now, it's also worth talking about what Java applets are. Back then, it was something people would have taken for granted, but these days, it's rather unknown. The reasons for that are complex, but basically boil down to security reasons. Turns out running something like that isn't exactly, easy to keep secure.
Yeah, so the game was run in browser up until mid-2010, which we'll get onto later. And it's similar to like a Flash game type of setup where it was actually just within the browser itself. It used Java applet code, which is just a method of running a Java app within the browser. And now you can't, in basically all modern browsers now, other than ones specifically designed for running older games, you can't run any applets like that anymore because they have security risks. And I believe from like Java 8 onwards, it just doesn't allow you to do it due to the security risks. Yeah.
It's also worth mentioning, back to the worlds, that we do actually have a world from even before the release of Minecraft.
Yeah.
I believe the world is from the 16th of May, and it comes from Notch's then girlfriend, EZ, spelled E-Z, Ellen Zetterstrand. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm not Swedish, and if not, I apologize. But whose brother, by the way, ended up doing the paintings for Minecraft, which we'll get into later. But,
yeah, Christopher, I believe it's called. Yeah.
Yes, it's very important. And so we have that world because Ellen actually gave them to us herself, which was, by the way, very, very nice of her. We greatly appreciate that. And it shows, some of the earliest buildings that we have ever, gotten record of in the game. We have pictures from 2009, and then we can load up the world and see the actual stuff ourselves in person, which is rather surreal. So that was, I believe, May 16th. The next big version to talk about is 0.0.15a, which was the first multiplayer version. And we don't have the world that Notch used to test out multiplayer here, but we are trying to find it because it was actually on the website for a while.
Yeah, it was made available.
For a short time.
Yeah, so that's a whole... We know this from IRC logs. It was released in a zip file with other multiplayer test world files, yeah. But we do have the first ever multiplayer compatible client, the first ever 0.0.15a, which is pretty good in itself.
Yeah, it's actually quite remarkable. The story behind that is quite remarkable.
Yeah, as with a lot of version finds, it was honestly, I would say, based on a lot of factors, but kind of just pure luck. Like, we do know the reasons why we were able to find that. It's a complicated thing to do with the whole Java applet code and where the client files were saved. Like, a lot of complications with that led to it still being able to be around on someone's hard drive, even, well, it was in 2020 when it was found, so... Yeah,
it's important to note that not all the versions we find were explicitly kept at the time. Some of them were, but oftentimes, such as that 0.0.12a_03 that I mentioned, that was found simply because it was
Yeah.
cached on their drive from the Java applet.
Yeah, and the person who had it had no idea. Yeah. In fact, I believe that person specifically was like very skeptical when we contacted them and were like, "I'm almost certain that I won't have anything, but I will check just in case." And they were very surprised, yeah, to find it.
So at this point, from 0.0.15a, we're now in, I believe that was late May.
Yeah, it began May 31st, yeah.
Yes, and then so now we're into June. And June is, for the first half of the month, mainly about trying to get multiplayer to a better place. Not really adding much to the base game, but a few things here and there. Mainly, though, the big update that came after finally multiplayer was a bit more stable was 0.0.19a and 0.0.20a, which were released just within a day of each other and were radically different, but show the quick transition from the very simple early Minecraft to the more familiar classic that we know today. 0.0.19a added sponges. It added the bar at the bottom of the screen, the block bar, instead of having the blocks in the top right of the screen. And it allowed more, choice to choose from. It also removed cobblestone for a while, which is, I believe, the only time
sand,
it was ever removed from the game. Although it wasn't, by the way, removed from the game. It was just made unavailable without world editors. But
I believe that even when you do hack it into the game, it can't be placed, as far as I'm aware.
that's very strange. I didn't even know that until now. Wow. But so you have...
Yeah, and also glass was added in that version as well.
Yeah, glass was added. Most of 0.0.19a's various bug fix versions are lost, but we do have two of them. And you can play these very strange transitional versions to this day. And then the big update that finally brought Minecraft to a more aesthetically pleasing place was 0.0.20a, which added the blocks such as wool. There are a few others, can't really think of them right now, but wool, which were, by the way, different colors from what they would end up being. They were colors like chartreuse, spring green, capri, ultramarine, magenta, and rose. These end up being changed later, but they brought some very nice color to the game, which had otherwise been sort of these muted tones before, except for sponge, I suppose. And then,
yeah, I believe it also added flowers and gold blocks.
Yes, gold blocks, which have a very different texture than what they would end up having later during the alpha. And by the way, that's important to note here, is that we're calling these things pre-classic or classic, but back then they would have just been called alpha, which is a bit confusing.
Yeah, the whole thing was called alpha.
Yeah, because obviously there wasn't a later there was a later version in 2010, a series of time where it was called alpha, but it's more just odd naming decisions on Notch's part. But it was all alpha until you get to beta, just various delineations of alpha, and that what we now call classic. So the classic era started when the game was released, and now we're about halfway through it with 0.0.22a, and this is the first time that you can actually hear things in the game, which is a bit odd. At this point, we're already about, I believe, a month and a half into Minecraft being public.
Yeah, and it was late June 2009.
Late June 2009, and the absolutely iconic music of C418 first is heard here in game with 3 songs: Calm 1, Calm 2, and Calm 3. And now there was also a version that there was also a song, Calm 4, that we should probably talk a little bit about here because there's some confusion surrounding it.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion with this. Even to this day, we don't know all of the information. But I believe even on like the official wiki, there's still some not disinformation, but just not fully correct information. So from around that time in 2009, when sounds were first added, up until even I believe like mid 2011, this Calm 4 song kept popping up, and it's actually, the song itself predates Minecraft. It's a song made by Notch called Magnetic Circuit, and you might know it from it has in the middle him saying Mojang specifications in a strange voice. And So what we do know from IRC logs is on that day when 0.0.22a was released, Calm 4 was included in the resources folder, but it was very quickly changed to be a duplicate of, I believe, Calm 2, which is Clark, I believe, the song. But we do know for at least some point during that day, people could hear that Calm 4 song. And then the reason why it's kind of a mystery to this day is because at various points in 2010 and early 2011, people reported hearing that song. And the reason why is, and we now have evidence that it was true, like that was being heard, because we've had recovered resource folders from the time that include it. Specifically, we know now that around late alpha, so alpha 1.2.6, during December 2010 was a time when it seemed to be around. And I believe the reason why is because that file was sitting in like Notch's server files, and I believe at various points was accidentally added to the files that were meant to be made available for download by the client. Possibly not intentionally quite a few times, because I believe they had some problems with like the resources folder, and obviously when mid-alpha, when the whole website had to be overhauled, that probably also had something to do with it. But interestingly, there's been a persistent rumor for ages that people were hearing it during alpha 1.1.1, and we now believe that that wasn't the case. There's no evidence of it being available at the time, and in fact, when we did recover alpha 1.1.1, the person that gave it to us actually also had the resource folder from the time, and it did not contain Calm 4. Obviously, it's entirely possible it might have been very briefly available during that time. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic that we don't really know a lot about, but what we do know is that it was briefly available at various points in 2010 and 2011. And it's one of the songs that wasn't made by C418.
Yeah.
It was made by Notch himself.
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating and strange. But at this point in the game, we now sort of have the basic part of Classic locked down. That is, it was at just this point all creative, although it wasn't really called that at the time, but it was no survival whatsoever, just building, and that's where we move on to what is called survival tests, which is a short period of time. I think it only lasted a matter of 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, so it started in September, ended in October, or technically November was the final release, yeah, early November, but...
And, well, it added things like you are actually, when you break a block, you get the block in your inventory, and, well, all the things you take for granted in survival. Things at this time, during this period, like creepers were added, which, by the way, were an accident. Notch was trying to add pigs into the game and messed up the model during the attempt to add it, and it ended up standing up straight, and he thought, well, that looks interesting. And at the time, he already had the leaf texture that he had added earlier in Classic, and it turns out that the creeper is actually a leaf texture applied to a messed up pig model, which is, well,
yeah,
being resourceful on Notch's part, and it worked out really well. And during this time, also, of course, sheep were added.
Yeah, so the creeper texture, that was, I believe, only used for the first 3-4 days, and then it was changed, but initially it was based off the leaf texture, yeah. And that's actually interesting because when we discovered that fact, it wasn't known until we actually found the version with that texture. And then people noticed that, I think it was around 2010, 2011, someone asked Notch on his Tumblr what would a creeper feel like, and he said it would feel like leaves, which obviously that now makes sense and was kind of a hint to that, but no one had actually noticed that the texture itself was based on leaves. Yeah, so there were also various other mobs added.
Yeah, like
at the time.
Spiders related added early on, which looked quite different. They had these being brown on the body with black eyes. We don't have that version. We're looking desperately, but maybe someday. And they're also even...
I believe it was development only. We're like not 100% certain on it, but I think it probably was development only at this point.
Yeah. And at this point, there was also... more people getting into the game, but it was still pretty small at this point in time, and where we start to get into the late Classic period, where he stopped working on survival for a little bit to just sort of wrap up the game as it was in the state it was at that point. He released 0.30, which is, by the way, mislabeled in the launcher. But anyways, this version had a survival and creative versions of it. And here is where we sort of see the last time that Notch worked on creative at all until actually almost 2 years later with the release of Beta 1.8. So from this point forward, he's just focusing on survival.
Yeah, so Notch had somewhat of a plan for the game, but it wasn't really that concrete. I know that he knew he wanted to develop survival into like the main game mode, which is why he then moved on to the indev phase of the game, obviously. And so creative kind of took a backseat. Obviously, the first version of indev was actually creative as well. And then that's when in the first version of indev, he added dynamic lighting. That was the main feature, really.
Mm-hmm. And this is probably, at least in my opinion and the opinion of some of my colleagues, is one of the strangest periods in the game and sort of some of the most misunderstood versions, because
indev, yeah,
indev. And part of the reason for that is that I believe the entirety, or at least most of indev, you actually had to pay for the game. Am I correct?
Yeah. So what it actually was, I believe, is that Notch, for the whole development cycle of like Survival Test and Classic, had been posting sort of sneak peeks on his Tumblr and on Twitter and in the IRC chat towards like what he was developing. And I think people got a bit fed up of that, and he kind of decided that he would give them an opportunity to then play those sneak peeks, essentially. And that's how indev really came into being. Survival Test was also paid early on as well. So the game was actually available to buy from early June 2009, but at that point, the only thing buying the game allowed you to do was to change your skin. But then by Survival Test, the early Survival Test was paid only, but then it was later made available, I believe, during 0.26 for free. And then indev was the start of really making it like this whole idea of a sneak peek thing that only people who paid were able to access the new sort of stages of the game. So it was really considered a test type of thing, which is why there's a lot of versions of it. Like, as we know today, there were many patches, sometimes many patches within the same day. And also indev was very much a transition stage into like the game that we know today. So it added a lot of features that turned Minecraft into what Minecraft is really, including mining and crafting, ironically. Smelting with furnaces, all of that, farming, various other features. The inventory itself was added as like the survival inventory during indev. Armor, a lot of different features that you would think were like normal and already you'd think they would already be in the game from early on, but actually weren't added until indev. Was a very much transition period.
Yeah, it is rather ironic that a game called Minecraft only had the mine part of it until January 28th, 2010, which is when they finally, Notch finally added some crafting, although it was just test crafting. Just you put an apple in, you get an arrow out. Didn't start adding real recipes until January 29th. So it was pretty much just mine for all of 2009 and the earliest part of January 2010. Now, also, it's important to note that during this time, Classic didn't just go away. Far from it. It was actually still the most popular game mode because, well, it was free. And
it was multiplayer.
Yeah, it was multiplayer, which, indev wasn't. And so if you wanted to play Classic, you still very much could on the website, and it remained that way actually until 2015. And now, of course, skipping ahead quite a bit, there was that JavaScript version of Classic that was released much later on. What year was that?
2019.
2019.
Yeah, for the 10-year anniversary.
And it has it's not actually quite one-to-one with the original Classic version, but we won't get into that all right now. But suffice it to say that you had indev running concurrently with all the people still playing 0.30. And there's it was a bifurcation of Minecraft that wasn't really mended until, as I said, 2011 with Beta 1.8. So
another thing I forgot to mention is that it added the concept of items itself, really. Like before that, the only items in the game were blocks. So items that could be held in player's hand. That was a new concept within itself. Obviously, tools, pickaxes, axes, hoes, all of that ended up having their uses during that part of the game as well. There's also another important part to mention about indev, which is the whole art direction. Had a weird shift due to the fact that Notch actually recruited someone, a guy known, his online name is Doc, I believe his real name is Hayden something, and he was recruited as the art director of the game, and he made these models for the game, 3D MD3 models of these different characters. The main one being Rana, that people will know about. That was in the game for well over a month. And then there was a couple of others that were only in the game for a very short time. Because at the end of January, Notch ended up cutting ties with Doc and just going back to having his own mob design. So during that point where Rana was available, Notch removed his own mobs from the game, so it was just Rana. So Rana is it's this frog, a girl with a frog hat model. And then there's also Steve, Black Steve, and Beast Boy, which were added later on. Steve is just essentially like a change to the human mob. Well, it's based on the human mob, but it's in the style that Doc was going for, which is kind of hard to describe style. If you've seen it, you'll know.
It's very bubbly looking. It's kind of cutesy looking.
Yeah, quite cutesy looking. Short, quite thick, like arms and legs. So sort of different to the blocky style from before. So not as much cubism, but more. There is more like circular design. And then obviously we don't really know the exact circumstances of why Notch decided to end the partnership with Doc, but immediately after that, all of those mobs were removed. This was about halfway through indev. Briefly, they were replaced with the Steve human mob for about 2 days. And then finally Notch added back all of the old mobs, so pigs, sheep, all the monsters, zombie, skeleton, spider, and then the game. Shortly after that, the game really, that's when you get towards the end stages of indev, where it was mostly adding a couple of small features, armor, paintings, sharpening things up, that sort of thing, fixing bugs, until the end of indev, which was February 23rd, 2010. So it was quite a short development cycle as well, only lasted about 2 months total, yeah.
Yeah, it was a very strange time during the game. There was even a point where you would be smelting blocks, not by putting them in a furnace, but by throwing them into a fire, which...
Yeah, so furnaces were added late February, I believe.
Yeah, and so was it at the time also what we would think of as a very basic part of the game now. The day and night cycle didn't exist until February 11th, and actually when it was added, there weren't even stars at that point. It basically just had a sun and a moon, and then it got dark, and then it was even not quite dark because there was still a glitch that oftentimes meant that the land was still lit up even though the sky was dark. Yeah. So it was a very strange version. It was fixed the next day, but for a time there, it was a rather, ominous version. So we hope to find that version someday. Maybe we'll be lucky enough.
Yeah, unfortunately it is lost, but we do have a lot of information about it and some images as well, yeah. So that's how we know all of this information. Yeah, another example of a removed feature that was in indev is giants, which they were added during a development version. I believe we probably at this point can kind of conclude that they weren't ever actually available within a released version, but we don't know that for certain because we don't have every indev version that was released. And they were then quickly decided against. Actually, the giant, as you've probably seen, is a giant zombie, essentially. It's a massive zombie that Notch was planning as sort of like a boss mob. But then it was very quickly removed. And it remained unused in the game for quite a long time, but I believe it's now the code for it has actually been removed in somewhat recent release version. I don't remember the exact time of that. Yeah, and then it's kind of important to go over the landscape of the community at that time. People, I think, as you said, not as many people were playing indev, but there were people playing it and they were enjoying it. And obviously some of it was very buggy, but when it got to the point where it was starting to get stable, that was when Notch just kind of randomly had the idea to implement infinite generation, which is not truly infinite, but it is basically a very large world size that you would never be able to truly fully investigate yourself, to explore the entire world. So it ends up being essentially infinite to the player. I believe it was fairly spontaneous. Yeah. he just decided to try and do it one day, and he worked out that he could do it. And he actually released a poll on, I think it was on his Tumblr. I think you can still find the poll today. I have looked at it before. And ironically, he asked people whether they would want him to move to infinite terrain or not. And the community actually voted no, because they were more invested in the indev version and like where it was going. But he decided against what the community wanted, and went with this whole new stage of the game, Infdev, which is the first of the like next delineations of the different development eras of the game. And like ironically, that is probably the decision that led to the game having the success it has today, which was him going against the community. So it's quite amazing.
Yeah, I guess in that case, every once in a while you just have to take your own position on things and see out your own vision. And well, we can be glad that he did. It wasn't easy though, because when Infdev started, well, first of all, it's a portmanteau, I suppose, of infinite and development. I guess it makes sense. Didn't really have to say it, but it makes sense. But it also was really sort of starting from fresh, brand new, because it wasn't like he just took indev and then said, well, I'll just do this but infinite. He had to basically start from square one. The first version of Infdev is extremely basic in what you can actually do.
Yeah.
While it is...
It's basically going back to the cave game era of the game almost, with the like how accessible all the different features are. You can't... you can only place and build blocks, and you're only given access to a really small amount of blocks. Only the ones that are generated, and also you get given glass blocks, I believe, in the first version of Infdev. And then obviously you have this whole massive infinite world. It's very weird in the first version. There's the what people call the obsidian wall, which is a 4-way obsidian wall that goes along the 4 axes of the world. And also there's randomly generated well, they're actually not randomly generated, what people call brick pyramids. Neither of these things actually were ever given official names. The obsidian wall only lasted that version, and was then removed in the following version. The brick pyramids lasted a bit longer. They lasted about a month into Infdev's development, and they actually spawn at specific places in the world every single time that are predetermined. So you do actually, if you go to a certain point in the world, you will find a brick pyramid there. I don't think that was known at the time. We only discovered that like in recent years.
And sadly enough, the first version is actually lost, the very first version. We have the second one, but the first one actually had pyramids with the tops cut off because of, I think Notch forgot to fix something with how the world height was set.
Yes, I believe that's the case. Yeah, so it was released as with a lot of versions out there that are lost, they were released for a very short amount of time. I believe this one was only for about 20-30 minutes before it was then changed to the one we have. This was February 27th, 2010. Yeah, and as you said, it was very buggy. Lots of things didn't work. I believe the version after that, which is March 13th, if you open the inventory, the game closes, for example, just like very serious bugs like that. And like not many features were added. So what Infdev really was to start with was just re-implementing all of the features that were in Indev, and slowly sort of changing the world generation into what it became almost, for most of Alpha really, originated in like mid-Infdev era.
What's interesting is that there was actually a small time during the middle of Infdev, around April, and it's just a bit of a fun fact that it actually had the pretty much same generation that you would see in later versions of beta that you just don't see in alpha. And it was just a short time because he was going through all these different variations of the world generation to get exactly what he wanted. But he happened to come across one that was pretty much like beta. So if you were to type in the famous glacier seed, which by the way, that seed option wasn't added until much later in the game. But if you use an editor to do that, you can actually see pretty much the same world just in Infdev. So he started adding pretty much everything back in. He, even for a short time, added a very, very novel kind of water physics, which I don't even quite completely understand, but it was an attempt at sort of making it finite in a way, like it would flow and then it would sort of fill up an area. You have to see videos of it. Look it up.
Eventually it did become finite, yeah. So even during Indev, water was not finite, and neither was lava. So they continuously flowed.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, I believe so. So as we were saying, like Infdev, a lot of it was re-implementing features that sort of ended. I believe like early June was the point where it was really considered like stable. You had crafting, proper physics of things, all of the different features from Indev, like smelting, all of that was like properly working. You could like actually play the game even by sort of like late March, which is when actually world saving was added for Infdev, which is still the same like save format that we have today, originated in March 27th. Yeah, so, and like as you were saying with the water being made finite in Infdev, that was a big change, because in all of the versions before that, such as in classic multiplayer, it's infinite, and that meant that it led to a lot of problems with like people flooding servers, because whenever people would cheat water into their inventory, and they could just place it and it would flood the entire map. And also with lava as well, they did it, and there's quite a few famous videos from the time of people doing that that you might have seen on YouTube. I believe there's one specifically that's like really well known, that is from 0.0.16a_02, which is a massive lava flood. That kind of shows that mechanic, yeah. So obviously making it finite, that was a big change. And as you said, I think there is some weird physics going on at that point, but it was then changed to sort of what we know today.
Yeah, very strange. I don't quite understand it, but going back to creative, what you were talking about with those servers, at this time, we also start seeing, in the other half of Minecraft, I mentioned the bifurcation earlier. In the creative side, the classic side, you had these servers that were very popular during the Infdev alpha phase. Things like the lava survival, things like Spleef, which was really popular at this time.
I think we're going to cover Spleef, especially in a later episode as well.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this
because all of those are, it's very interesting. There was that was kind of the origin of what people call minigames today. So Spleef was really the first one, was made in June 2009. I can't remember the names of all the people that came up with it, but we actually are in contact with all of the people who were involved in the creation of it. We've contacted them for our own purposes, obviously trying to ask them for if they have any old versions. So we know a little bit about the origin of Spleef. I believe it started in around 0.0.21a, so late June 2009, and that is where everyone starts out on this massive plane, and they have to break blocks to try and force the other players through and out of into water or lava, or just out of it. And the last player standing on the big flat plane is the winner. And then obviously you have lava survival, which you mentioned, which is just trying to survive as long as possible to get away from the flooding lava, the lava that floods into all areas, as we were talking about, because it's infinite. And the last player to get away from the lava was the winner.
Mm-hmm. So here we are, pretty much at the end of Infdev. We have doors, we have the water physics that we're more familiar with. We also, at this point, have minecarts, which were added in the first of many updates, which would be called Secret Friday update. And it's pronounced secret because there are actually two E's. Don't know why. Notch was just being a bit cheeky, I suppose. But he started these updates and would just sort of drop things, to the players every Friday, or not. I don't know exactly the rates.
Yeah, I can talk about it. So, as you were saying, by this point, we'd got to the point where everything from Indev was added. Then Notch started to finally add new features to Infdev, the first of which were like doors, ladders, that kind of thing. And then on, I believe it's June the 18th, is the first Secret Friday update, and that is the one that adds minecarts. And it was kind of, the idea was that he would just say, he said that they were unannounced, but really he did make an announcement every time, but he wouldn't say what was in it. So it was kind of like up to the player to find out what had been added. And they were done sporadically until September 2010. So during the alpha, they went into alpha. In fact, most of them are during the alpha phase of the game. There's only 2 during Infdev. And they weren't every week. There were gaps, but it was fairly regular. I believe at least 1 or 2 a month for that entire period.
So there was also a point during this time, during the transition, where a launcher was actually made available for the game instead of just having to play it on browser.
Yeah, so the game was finally made available offline. Before that, there were third-party offline clients, but this was the first time where it was officially made available offline. The first launcher was actually made available on one of the final Infdev versions, I think the June 29th. We actually have the first launcher as well, and quite a few of the first launchers, because there weren't that many early on. So we do know like the history of that. So yeah, that was definitely like a big change. It wasn't no longer... You could still play it in the browser, and people did, but people definitely switched over to offline because it was a lot easier to play around with and just to have all your files and everything together, which is really, I think, what then helped to make people take the game a bit more seriously as well, because the fact that it had been out at this point for over a year and you couldn't officially play it offline is quite weird to think about.
Yeah, it is pretty strange, and it's also interesting that this playable browser version actually was still continually playable up until 2013 with the version 1.5.2. So at a certain point in 2013, you could still load up the browser and just play the latest release version of Minecraft, but that stopped at release 1.6 because the website was redesigned, and at that time there was really no motivation to keep that on the website anymore, because even by then the security concerns, I think, were already beginning to be made known, except notably for Classic, because it still had a player base that was pretty large because of all the people that had been playing it throughout the entire time. It was the only way to be playing creative mode during the whole survival phase of the development. So it was during this time that we now have the alpha phase, which is, by the way, a bit confusing because the first version of alpha technically is actually labeled Infdev. It was retroactively called Alpha 1.0.0, but there's actually no version where you're going to see that in-game. The first version called Alpha in-game is Alpha 1.0.1, which is also the first version to add redstone. It's also, by the way, a secret Friday update. It was number 3. And it added, well, all the redstone things like iron doors, levers, redstone ore, redstone torches, buttons, and pressure plates. At this time, also, redstone was, I would say, annoying because if you walked on top of it, it would break. The redstone dust would just break if you walked on it. I don't really get what he was thinking there, but they did end up changing it, so can't be too mad about it. But it was, able to open up a lot of possibilities, even, not long afterwards, despite the fact that it was pretty simplistic in what you could do with it. People were able to build computers of sorts, maybe more accurately called calculators, and despite no repeaters available, you were able to sort of hack together a repeater with a redstone torch and a block with some redstone dust going to the back of it. So people were really creative already at this point early on in the game, and also at this point, the game was starting to kind of blow up a bit. It was increasingly getting more and more popular from the end of Infdev until around the August-September era. We also, in early alpha, have the beginning of sort of introducing biomes, although they weren't really biomes at this point because it was just the regular world with, the lime green grass, and then in Alpha 1.0.4, Secret Friday Update 4, the introduction of winter worlds. Now, winter worlds would only be generated 25% of the time, random chance when you generate it, and there weren't seeds that you could put in at this point without world editors, so it really was just, luck. And whenever you made a world, if you got lucky enough and you got a winter world 25% of the time, it would just be, snow everywhere, the water would be frozen, and that's when, those were added, those various features that wouldn't be made into proper biome form until the Halloween update, which we'll get into.
Yeah, so then there was various different small updates. Alpha was updated quite regularly, various different small updates, until we get to arguably one of the most important changes, which is that finally Notch started to work on multiplayer for a survival version of the game, as Alpha specifically. It started off as a private test with just people in, I think it was a private, the OPs of the IRC, the official IRC channel were allowed in. And that was early alpha. That was like alpha 1.0.10, I believe, was the first one that people were able to join. The password for that server ended up being leaked during alpha 1.0.12. And so a lot of people then were able to join it during that point. A person that we ended up being in contact with years later actually took packet captures of that multiplayer test, which allowed us to now have some of the worlds from that test, which is quite an amazing find, really, because they were never supposed to be available to anyone, but we now were able to reconstruct those worlds from packet captures. And then so we had a few more updates during that time. 1.0.13, which was one of the Secret Friday updates, I believe. Actually, was that? No, I believe that 1.0.12 was a Secret Friday update. Anyway, around that time, just as an example of how the game was increasing in popularity, Notch actually released a version. He re-uploaded 1.0.13.01 to have a splash screen that mentioned that there had been 1,000 sales of the game within 24 hours. So that was quite a big achievement for him. Obviously quite a big, because in only one day it was selling 1,000 copies, whereas in like early 2009, if that it would sell 1,000 copies, I think it took like 2 weeks for that to happen, or probably more than that. So by alpha 1.0.15, we then had the official release of survival multiplayer, but it was very unstable, and actually unstable until the end of alpha, because really the delineation between alpha and beta by Notch was considered to be when survival multiplayer was stable. And that was when, obviously, in reality, when beta 1.0 came out, it actually wasn't stable fully, but it was a lot more stable than alpha. Yeah, so one of the like main examples is server-side inventory wasn't a thing. It was client-side, I think, during at least part of it. And that was the main problem, was you couldn't, so your inventory wasn't saved to the server, so when you could leave the game, but then when you joined back, it wouldn't be that you wouldn't have your items anymore, so it was kind of a bit pointless to play at that point.
Yeah, it was all for testing at that point, just trying to get all the bugs worked out and finally, make sure that the game was at least playable. And the blow up of the game during this time, popularity-wise, was also mirrored in people beginning to, form urban myths around it. Myths such as Herobrine. This is where his story begins. With alpha 1.0.16_02, there was a creepypasta posted on 4chan with the now famous image of a player looking in the foggy distance, seeing the shadowy figure of Herobrine.
So it's also worth mentioning that that original screenshot, we now know that that probably wasn't the origin, because there is some evidence of a similar concept, white eyes, on the forums from about a month before, I believe. But we don't. I haven't been involved in the research for that, so I can't say a lot about it. But I have watched some videos on it, so I'm sure the people involved in that would be able to give a lot more information. But I know that now it's a lot less clear, like the exact origin of Herobrine as a concept. But that definitely was what started the popularity of it, was that 4chan post, which led to the infamous Brocraft stream, which was actually in alpha 1.0.17, which is the one where they used a changed door texture as to show it. And that was, I think that was really what got people like seeing it, because people were watching that stream beforehand, and then during that was how like it really popularized it, because a lot of people saw that stream. That led to the urban legend really developing into its own thing that still persists to this day.
And also it's worth remembering that the original creepypasta world, even though we really just saw a small part of it and most of it was obscured by fog, the good people at Minecraft at Home were actually able to reverse engineer the world. It's a very complex process that I definitely don't fully understand, but using a mixture of reconstructing everything that they could see in the screenshot and then putting maths on top of that, they were able to actually show us, give us the seed that now people can just, load up the world and go to that exact same spot where it was originally taken, which is, I think, fascinating and something that I think 10 years ago would be even difficult to believe. But we now have the power to do that, and wow. So, we have that happening with the Herobrine, this sort of new urban legend in the game. And then at the same time, a bit later in, I think now September, the game had grown to the point that there was actually a, accidental DDoS, or distributed denial of service, because the game was getting so popular. I now remember, because I actually did help in the search for Alpha 1.1.1, that I remember at the time people being very disappointed that no biomes were here. They were expecting it, and then it just looks like the same thing, except that now, in this new Secret Saturday update, which by the way was the only Secret Saturday update, the game was gray screening, which never, was a bug that had happened before, but basically it was an issue with some code relating to Gamma, and it resulted in people thinking that the game, the website's down, and now the game is gray screening. A lot of people were getting angry at Notch on that one day, and there was a lot of pressure there. But thankfully, the game pulled through, and 1.1.2 alpha was then released, which thankfully sort of cleared everything, and the website was able to get back on track, and things cooled down for a while. And when I say they cooled down for a while, it also sort of cooled down for a while development-wise, because there was a good period of about a month where I think over a month, it was September to October 31st, late September, where the game was just sort of sitting in the same state, which is something that it really hadn't done at all up until this point. And people were starting to get a bit antsy, and they're, already a bit angry at Notch because they made their games gray screen, and now they're saying, well, where's this version you've been promising us? We thought we were going to get it in September. Instead, you gave us a non-working website. What are we supposed to do? So you might want to explain a bit more about that, yeah?
There had been breaks in development before that, but not. I feel like that was the first time where a break happened, that they also, in combination with the fact that the player base was growing, so people actually noticed the break. Because like in survival tests, there was a big break, also in Infdev as well. But this was the first time where there was a big player base that were demanding all of these things, and then they were like, why is this not being added? And so I think that's probably why then Notch did take a sort of time to actually properly implement biomes and all of the features for what became the Halloween update. Alpha 1.2.0, which was really the end of Alpha. The versions after that were just bug fixes for the most part. And so it was all, even when it did eventually release, like it wasn't fully like functional until really the proper end of Alpha, when he kind of fixed a lot of the bugs. And then, as I was saying earlier, like the change into beta was because he decided that finally he thought multiplayer was stable enough to be considered like playable. So he changed the development stage to beta, yeah.
There was also, during this time, of course, the zombie pigmen, which is actually a bit of an interesting story, because we have in our Omni Archive server a member by the name of Mickley, who is very major in the story of how pigmen came about. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I don't know the whole story, but I know that for a while, Mickley had played the game since 2009, like very early on. And had been suggesting to Notch for, I believe, like months at that point, that to add this concept of a pigman, which was the skin that he used. And that ended up evolving into what eventually became the zombie pigman. The texture for the zombie pigman was actually also made by a player called Exophobia, which we've also contacted in the past. So it's a very interesting thing. And then also, because of Mickley's contribution to that, he was temporarily given a cape, of which it was bacon coloured, and then due to like community being annoyed about like exclusivity of things like that, Notch ended up taking it away. But I'm sure we'll be discussing that more later on, because I think we'll have Mickley on for an episode to talk about that whole experience, and also because he was quite involved in the modding community at the time, so we'll be talking about that.
And during this time, speaking of textures and stuff, it was in Alpha 1.2.2 that you actually had support officially for texture packs, not resource packs, because you couldn't replace the sound, but you could start easily replacing the textures. However, it is also worth noting that texture modding had already been a big part of the game for over a year at this point, with various people just doing it on their own. It wasn't as easy, but they were at least able to do things like change blocks to look like televisions or whatnot. And also during the parts of the Halloween update, towards the end, actually soon before he was going to release it, he still hadn't quite settled on a name. The name The Nether really only came into, set in stone until I think a day or two before release. Before then, he considered calling it The Slip. He'd also considered calling it The Core. And why he went with The Nether, I don't exactly know. Do you know?
No, I don't know.
And, well, for whatever reason, he named it that. It ended up working. And throughout the rest of Alpha, it was pretty much just bug fixes, getting everything tidied up after the major 1.2 update, which had pretty much changed the fundamental nature of how Minecraft looked for one of the first times. There had been generation changes before, but never before had there been all this grass coloration and all this dynamic diversity to the world. Really, it was, in a way, some of the biggest changes to the aesthetics since the classic 0.20a that added all the wool. So you see that, beginning to form with all the fascinating diversity, and there was this version that some of you might have heard of during this period of sort of bug fixing that is called Alpha 1.2.3 underscore 03. And, well, you might want to talk about that a bit, Rufus.
Yeah, so that's a missing version that we don't even know if technically it existed. I lean towards that it probably didn't exist at this point, because we have zero evidence from the time of it existing, of people mentioning that as a name at all, whereas for, every other version, even ones that were out for a very short amount of time that are missing, we know did exist, mostly from IRC logs like we've been talking about. And it's actually quite funny, one thing that originates from our community, which kind of is very ironic, that we try to prevent disinformation, but one of our members I believe it was around 2018, as a joke, made a creepypasta about this Alpha 1.2.303 version, saying that it was a Herobrine version, which this had never been. No one had ever said this before. This was all new, this made up story about it. But for some reason, people actually picked up on that and they started making YouTube videos about it. And if you Google the version today, you can find hundreds of videos, especially on the Russian internet, of people playing modded versions of the game that are supposed to be Alpha 1.2.3 underscore 03. So ironically, our community actually created that as an idea, even though that's the opposite of what we really want to do. So yeah, that's a whole thing in itself.
Yeah, that is pretty ironic, but I guess it was sort of its own creepypasta in a way, sort of in the tradition of Herobrine. The first version of Beta 1.0, came out on December 20th, 2010. Now, to put things into perspective, Indev, Infdev, and Alpha took place almost entirely in 2010, except for a few Indev versions in late 2009. And that really shows how fast development was moving, that we went through all of that extremely, formative development just in 2010.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because at the point we're talking about now, the start of beta is really where I would say the game becomes mostly recognizable to what you have today, or even earlier on than that. You can kind of say that, but I feel especially at this point, with biomes and stuff like that, changing the game quite a lot and the world layout. But it seems to really, that's the point at which from then on it's just additions of features, that some of important features which we'll talk about later on, like beds, which is obviously kind of changes the game quite a lot. But mostly from then on, it's just additions to the game rather than big changes, I would say.
Beta was also supposed to be really the point where multiplayer came out of its early development stage for survival and more came into its own in a less buggy, more refined state.
Yeah.
And I think that's true to an extent, although, of course, if you're anyone like me who has spent a significant time playing beta multiplayer, you will still find a fair number of bugs. It certainly
Yep.
wasn't fully polished, but at least is better than late alpha, multiplayer experiences.
Yeah, so also around that time is obviously when finally other developers were hired, because initially, like, Mojang wasn't really, it was a company the whole time, but the sole developer of the game was Notch up until this point, so late 2010, I believe, just before the first version of beta is when they were actually hired. But then really from like beta 1.0 onwards is when those developers really started to actually have an effect on how the game was made. So obviously Jeb is the big one, who then later became the creative lead of the game after Notch left in 2013, I believe. Yeah, well, really after release 1.0.
Yeah, and development also began to slow down at this point. I think,
Yeah,
going back to what we said, a lot of the fundamentals have been put down. At this point, it was more a matter of incrementally tweaking the game to improve it, as opposed to trying to lay down what the game is going to be about, like it was, especially during indev and infdev. So, as we said, a lot of important features were still added in beta. Some less important features, such as cloaks, were added. Early on, there was only the original brown and yellow Mojang cape that was in the game, cape/cloak. But, of course, others would begin to be added. There was also support for Dead Mouse's ears, the musician who was highly involved with Mojang at the time, because I guess he liked the game. I don't completely understand why, perhaps.
I don't know all of the history myself. I think he was at one point even worked on music with C418, which was, I think, meant to be in the game but ended up not being added. That could be wrong. I know he did work on music with C418. I don't know the extent to which it was meant to be official. But it was released, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that even though at this point the game had a lot more players and people were obviously starting to take the game more seriously, there are still lost versions from the beta time period, some of which we have been able to locate even fairly recently, but I think there's still a beta 1.3 that's missing.
Actually, I think that was found. That's
Really?
the most recent find. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very fortunate.
Yeah. So the most recent finds as of right now, as we're recording this, in late January, was it was the beta 1.3 missing version. I think the pre-re-upload, and that was in late December, I want to say. Yeah. So it was very recent. This was only about a month ago.
Wow. Well, that just shows that even after all these years, there's still progress being made.
Yeah,
so
and hopefully
we can't quite give up,
versions
can we?
to be found.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
true.
we have we're in beta now. The game is getting quite popular. If you look on YouTube from the time, you're going to already see a lot of Let's Plays. Already sort of Minecraft machinima. It was definitely, leaking into the culture quite a bit at this point. We also have beta 1.2, which was the first major update of the beta development phase. Added, lovely things like squids, which everybody loves. We have cakes, dispensers, lapis, note blocks, different types of trees, dyes, dyed wool. It added definitely a lot more color to the world, sort of in a way like Alpha 1.20.
Dyed wool obviously was in Classic, but it hadn't been available in Survival up until that point, outside of cheating it in.
Yeah, definitely added a lot more color to the world that had been sort of lacking since Classic. As I said, sort of like Alpha 1.2.0 in a way. This is also somewhat infamous for a bug where squids could be milked due to the code for the squid largely being copied from that of the cow. If you just went up to it with a bucket, right-clicked it, you could milk it like a cow. But the bug would be fixed, unfortunately, a few updates later. The fast render mod by Scavelus was also added into the game with Scavelus's permission. This marks the first time a fan-made mod was added into the game. which is fairly important because that would be a reoccurring theme in later versions. And I think to the betterment of the game overall, you want to work with your community, you want to get ideas from the community.
I think he's still credited in the credits today, I believe.
Wow, that's good. You also had then, of course, Beta 1.3, which added the very important redstone repeaters, without which all these famous Minecraft calculators and 16-bit computers and whatnot would be much more difficult / impossible, because this would be able to result in much smaller circuits as opposed to the computers of the early beta and alpha days, which were just insanely large, even crazier than the crazy big machines we have now. And there's also the smooth lighting engine that was that a mod? Or is that because it says it's Mr.
I believe
Messiah?
The code was copied from the mod by Mr. Messiah, yeah. With his permission. I believe he's also credited in the game credits as well. Yeah, as far as I remember, there's a few modders credited in the credits. Scavelus, as you said, Mr. Messiah, and then also much later on in release 1.6, I forget the guy's name, but the person who made Mo Creatures was credited for the horse model. I think it's Dr. Zark. Yeah.
Yeah, Mo Creatures was definitely a really popular mod at the time, and took a few years to get it in, but
eventually influenced horses, being added.
Yeah.
And then obviously the other most important feature of Beta 1.3 is beds, which kind of changed the game fundamentally in quite a lot of ways, because before this, the entire history of survival, ever since the day-night cycle was added, the whole gameplay loop revolves around you having to find somewhere to hide overnight, and to kind of not really do that much overnight, because at that point it's quite difficult to defend yourself against monsters and just do normal things in the nighttime. So most people would obviously hide within houses or caves away from mobs during the night. But this, obviously adding a feature where you can sleep overnight and just skip all of that time, massively changes the way that you play the game, because you can do a lot more in less time, I guess.
If any of you have ever heard of Kurt J. Mack, who was pretty popular back in the day, and to this day is still doing his Farlands or Bust series, it revolves around walking to the Farlands, and without beds, I would say it would be impossible. So, definitely a very important feature. There's also the texture for crying obsidian that was added in this update, but later removed. It was never used until it was actually re-added to the game many, many years later in release 1.16, the Nether update, which finally re-added crying obsidian and made it a real block in the game.
1.16 added it, as you said. And the reason why that was added in 1.3 is because I believe that was originally intended to be what became the bed mechanic. So it was going to be a way to set your spawn point. And then obviously it became that later on, but for the Nether. So when it was added to the Nether update, it allowed you to set your spawn point in the Nether. So yeah, it kind of came back years later with similar feature to its original intention.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you talk about these features that had been sort of dreamed up long in advance, hadn't been really brought to fruition, hadn't been reified until much later. There's also, I believe, if you look at Notch's Tumblr from perhaps back in, I think, 2009, could have been 2010, but he talked about, wanting to add villages, those sorts of things.
Quite a lot of other, yes. There's also one that came much later, I believe in 2010, I think June 2010, so during the Infdev phase, he talked about wanting to add coral, and even, I believe, tried to add it, and there is a weird texture that's found in the terrain PNG file at some point during Infdev, which some people believe is probably the result of him trying to do that, but he gave up. And then obviously years later in 1.13 aquatic update, coral was added.
I didn't even know about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And Beta 1.3 also added the McRegion level format, which was another mod by Scavelus. Basically another quality of life / getting the game more organized, being able to run better, that sort of thing. More in the background, but it made a big difference for how the game worked under the hood. And then there was the Beta 1.3_01, a pretty small update, but included a fix for the squid milk bug. And interestingly, this would serve as the basis for the PC Gamer demo. a free demo of the game that was included on a disc with copies of issue 214 of the PC Gamer magazine. The demo included a few exclusive elements, such as a special demo world with a giant PC Gamer logo, a hint system which didn't exist in the actual game, and an exclusive texture for cows that has the PC Gamer logo on the sides of their bodies.
Yeah, I think that is quite an interesting aspect of the history, because that demo probably introduced quite a lot of people to the game, because obviously PC Gamer is still quite a popular magazine. I'm sure it's a bit less relevant now than it was at that time, but at that time it was definitely very popular, so I'm sure there was quite a lot of people introduced to the game through that then bought it.
Yeah, weird little things like that can bring a lot of people to the game.
Yeah.
In March, on the 31st, 2011, we have Beta 1.4, another major update, which gives us things like wolves, cookies, and locked chests, which were an April Fool's joke. Attempting to open locked chests would open a prompt asking you to buy Steve Co. Supply Crate Key, a reference to Team Fortress 2 paid crate items. Clicking the store button would just take you to Minecraft.net, where no such item was ever available for purchase. The block was removed in the following update. This update also introduced a new logo for the game. Prior to this update, the logo on the title screen was made out of stone blocks, cobblestone, prior to Alpha 1.0.4. Starting with this update, the logo was updated to a stylized rendering not made out of blocks that looks largely similar to the logo that's used today. The old logo was sort of more, it was more thin, and this is the more bold.
It was a bit rudimentary.
Yeah, pretty rudimentary, although very nostalgic as well. Now we move on to Beta 1.5, which of course added things like rails, I should say powered rails, because the rails themselves were added all the way back in Infdev, but until this point you had to basically rely on gravity. And so this added powered rails, and then 1.6, Beta 1.6 added the trapdoor, dead bush, grass, maps, and nether support and multiplayer, which is sort of weird to think about, that from, the alpha, I guess alpha would have been in July when they were doing the multiplayer tests. Up until this point, there was no nether, alpha 1.20, alpha 1.2.0, there was no nether support at all from then until beta 1.6 if you were in multiplayer. So, it's something weird to think about that people oftentimes forget. And at this point, multiplayer gameplay still wasn't really on par with single player. It was still pretty glitchy, though it was at least rapidly improving, as I said, with the introduction of multiplayer in conjunction with the Nether. There's also a test build that Notch quietly put up on the server at the time, which we're going to talk more about when we have our guest Mickley on the show in a future episode, because he has an interesting story to share about it. And then Beta 1.7 came out in June 2011, which added pistons and sticky pistons. Pistons were originally part of a mod by Hippopotamus, who gave the code to Jeb to implement into the game.
Yeah, so another addition that was taken from a mod. I believe that's the last one before then horses, but there may have been others actually.
Might have been, I'm not sure, but it was certainly a very major one.
Yeah.
This update also added shears. Until this point, you simply punched a sheep to get them to drop their wool. Now, I think Beta 1.7 is, at least in my mind, perhaps the most interesting beta version, simply because of what it was going to be before it ended up.
Yes, it's definitely the most defining, I would say. Also, with Pistons, that obviously changed a lot about the way people make automated things in the game completely. Before then, it was quite difficult to make any type of farm or anything that was automated, but that was allowed it to start being a thing that would happen.
Yeah, what this did is sort of allowed Redstone to interface more with the outside world. At this point, you sort of had Redstone, and then you had the rest of the world, and now you had that interface with Pistons, and that really made a big difference. Obviously, that was what set the ground for the later flying machines of release versions. So, what's interesting about Beta 1.7 is that obviously Beta 1.8 turned out to be the big adventure update, which changed a lot of the fundamentals. Well, I shouldn't say necessarily fundamentals, but at least made a lot of changes to the game that fundamentally changed its gameplay and changed world generation and such. But that was originally going to be Beta 1.7. Beta 1.7 was going to be the adventure update. And there are a lot of fascinating development pictures from like June, maybe I think even some from May of 2011, where you see what was, planned to be 1.7 Adventure Update. In my mind, the most interesting parts are the really beautiful, if you can find pictures, look it up online, the beautiful colored lighting system that was planned to be added in beta 1.7, because at this point there was no colored lighting in the game in vanilla. And in these beautiful pictures, you can see it looked really natural. And unfortunately, in beta 1.8, the colored lighting system that we get is kind of more washed out. I don't know exactly why they didn't go with the original system they had in beta 1.7, but I don't know. Maybe they just ran out of time. They were also planning to add some like really beautiful rivers, which we did ended up getting that in one sense, yeah.
So obviously a lot of people nowadays talk about beta 1.7.3 specifically, so the end of the last patch for 1.7, as a cutoff point in terms of like what people consider the golden age of Minecraft in some respects. Obviously that's a very debatable topic in itself.
Yeah.
That we don't really want to get into, because I'm sure everyone has their own opinions on that. I
Pretty
have
subjective,
my own opinion as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very subjective. But it's definitely true that it's a big change afterwards. And it's quite interesting to look back at the development for then the next version, beta 1.8, the actual adventure update, or the first part of it. Because there are quite a lot of images online available of what of the development of it that show different ways that it could have gone, including, so one of the biggest or most controversial changes with beta 1.8 is the change to world generation, which until that point had been a fairly popular aspect of the game, I would say, and to this day a lot of people would say they prefer the beta 1.7 terrain to later versions. But we can actually see I think there's a specific image which you were talking about, shows rivers of a 1.8 development version, and the generation is a lot closer to sort of a hybrid of what we actually got and the beta 1.7 terrain that a lot of people probably would have maybe preferred. But it's interesting to think why it was that they chose to make bigger changes rather than sticking with something similar to like what we saw in that development build. And also a build was shown at PAX 2011, I believe, that was
There's
sort
a video
of
of it.
Yeah, there's a video of it as well. I think multiple videos, which show off early villages as well.
Yes, they do.
And also have this sort of hybrid terrain, which obviously it would be a very interesting thing if someday that a build of the game ends up turning up. But since it's a development version, I kind of doubt that will be the case. Unfortunately, I think it's fairly likely that Mojang still has the source code for that, because as far as we know, they do still have the source code for around late alpha onwards. I think based on a video they uploaded a few years ago, which showed the progression of the source tree over like a few years, and it started in, I want to say, November 2010. Yeah, so we do know that they most likely still have. So that it's nice to know that in some ways that probably does still exist on some computer somewhere. We just might never see it. Or maybe for the 20th anniversary or something, they might think about showing off some things like that. I don't know.
1.8, of course, as we said, added villages. There's also an early development screenshot where you can see a village without villagers, but a village that looks very, very different, looks sort of more, how should I say, like dwarfish, more elven looking. It's not the more standardized buildings that we get later. And another fascinating screenshot, as I said, there are many, many fascinating screenshots and videos of the development of 1.8 where it has sort of a hybrid look, and just seeing how things could have been different.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning, I think beta 1.8 is the first time that there was any type of real pre-release released to the public, although that is a whole controversial topic in itself, because it actually wasn't meant to be public originally, and it was only made public because one of the pre-releases was leaked online. But that's a topic that I think will be covered a bit more in a future episode as well, because there's a lot of interesting information there. That it's actually more of it has come to light recently.
Yeah, sort of the beginning of the snapshot system in a way.
Yes, it really was.
Iteration
yeah, definitely.
Accidental iteration, I should say.
Yeah.
Like you said. And of course, beta 1.8, whatever flaws it might have had, I think it definitely did the right thing when it re-added in creative mode. It fixed that bifurcation that I mentioned, that had existed since the beginning of indev. And finally, we had survival and creative in one version, which of course was a huge thing, and I think a change for the better.
Yeah.
Of course, though,
sure.
Classic would still persist for years, dwindling in popularity until it was removed from the website in 2015.
Yeah, I think really after that point, it was mostly multiplayer. Classic was what people used, and like old minigames, like as we were talking about before, Lava Survival. And then obviously the most controversial change, which we haven't actually talked about yet, is hunger, added in beta 1.8. Yeah, which does, I personally have never had too much of a anything against hunger, I would say, but I do understand the reasons why people don't like it. I think the reason why I probably personally have never had that much of a problem with it is because I started playing in release 1.1 February 2012, around that time. So by that point, my first experience with the game had hunger in it. So I've like, although I've obviously spent quite a lot of time in versions without it now, it never really ruins the game for me in that respect, I guess. But yeah, for a lot of people, obviously they consider that to be one of the features that they don't really like about this version. Yeah, it's definitely a controversial feature.
Yeah, well, it was the biggest version. It was the biggest update since Alpha 1.2.0, and
Yeah,
I think at least when you have an update that large, there's always going to be something in it. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I can't be too angry about it. And besides, it was at this point, oh my goodness, 12 years ago. So
the way I see it, I'm just glad that we still have the chance to play all of these versions now anyway. And so at the end of the day, the game has to progress in some ways. And although you're never going to agree with all of the changes. And the fact that we can go back and play them kind of is the silver lining, I guess.
Yeah, at least we can see how it progressed. And if nothing else, sort of learn from it and learn to see how games generally progress and what pitfalls and what triumphs they might have along the way. And we also, in beta 1.8, we don't just see the beta development phase sort of fruit and come to a more mature place. We also see it in preparation for release, where we see features such as ender pearls being added, but they had no use yet. They just were in preparation for when finally the end would be a part of the game in 1.0. And there was also some blocks like stone bricks, mushroom blocks, glass panes, melons. Mobs such as the cave spider, silverfish, and enderman were added. Again, no end, though, at this point. We also had the enderman with green eyes instead of purple in the pre-release versions.
Yeah, because obviously villagers weren't a thing yet, but villages, as in the homes, were, is another example.
Yeah. They were just empty at this point. And, of course, it also added a bunch more biomes along with changing the generation itself, such as having big oceans, really big oceans, that would end up sort of being a problem that was eventually fixed. Oceans, plains, deserts, extreme hills, forest, taigas, swamps, and rivers, which we mentioned earlier, having been in earlier development versions. There was also, of course, the poison effect, because we had finally the alchemy system sort of beginning to come in. Sprinting was added, and some people didn't really like it, as we said, stuck with beta 1.7.3. It was sort of a line of demarcation. And lastly, the title screen had another big change, which we hadn't really seen since the actual logo was changed back in earlier beta, where we had the panorama in the background. So instead of having the dirt background, we see the more familiar color panorama of a world.
Yeah, which of course later on is now a feature that changes every version or every major version.
Yeah, it was I think the same panorama in the background for
quite a long time.
8 years.
Yeah, I believe until at least 1.8, I want to say. It must be later than that even.
Yeah, it was. I remember it persisting for quite a long time. Actually, it persisted until around 1.13, which is very interesting. That was even longer than I thought.
That makes sense. That was because that was when like all of they started to make the updates a lot more major, I guess, again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Minecraft had that time in the wilderness for a while there.
Yeah.
But it came back strong. So now we're moving on to beta 1.9 / release 1.0, and the reason why we're saying that is because beta 1.9 is it calling them versions is once again sort of stretching the definition, because you might also just call them builds or even snapshots, as we said. You could view the entirety of beta 1.9 as just a series of snapshots for release 1.0, and I think really that's probably the best way to think of them, because the last real release of the game was beta 1.8 until you made it to 1.0, and all the snapshots in between that were called beta 1.9. So
and later the release candidates as well.
Yeah, release candidates even later on, after they were called beta 1.9. So we're going to be talking about the beta 1.9 and release candidate builds here, during which villagers were added, but they had the word testificate displayed over their heads. Now, if you ask me what that means, I don't know. All I can imagine is that it's the word test and then ificate added afterwards for fun. That's all I could think of. Currently, there's no trading, and they had no sounds. I remember when sounds were added in 1.6. Oh, I just got word in here for the producer. I get word in here that it says actually it means document of evidence in, I guess, Old Scottish, which is very interesting. I did not know that. I also don't know what that's supposed to mean.
Might just be a coincidence.
Being in the game.
Yeah.
But either way,
I don't think there were any Scottish developers at the time. There may have been, actually.
Yeah. The producer says it kind of raises more questions than answers, which I agree with. So, yeah, no sounds. They just walk around, not doing anything useful. The portal room was added to Strongholds, but again, no portal present yet because there was no end. Now we're in pre-release 2. A system to breed mobs was added, but there were no baby mobs yet. And the testificate name above villagers was removed. Don't know why it was ever there in the first place. Then we get a little bit later on, pre-release 3. They added the portal frame to the Stronghold portal room that looks different compared to the end portal design, a little bit different. The end portal itself is also present, but it doesn't do anything yet. It's just there. A white cobblestone texture is in the files, but that would end up being turned into endstone, which makes sense. Then we also had some strange glass pillars going up into the sky, used to mark the locations of strongholds in this update. Was that because the Ender portals didn't work yet?
I think Eyes of Ender didn't work, so there was no way to locate them. Yeah.
Yeah. So the items were there, but they weren't usable yet. And then the Eyes of Ender were added in this, and where they are capable of repairing the portal frame, but they don't locate strongholds yet, as we said. Something unique about this update is that the end as we know it today did not exist. In its place was the Sky Dimension. It was not accessible by normal means, but it was possible to enter it in this update in pre-release 3 by changing the region ID to 2, with 0 being the overworld, 1 being the nether. To give some backstory, the Sky Dimension was a planned update for a long time, dating back to May 2011. Notch's original plan for the Sky Dimension involved the player going to sleep in their bed and having a slight chance of waking up in the Sky Dimension, and later being able to access the Sky Dimension on purpose. It was basically meant to be an inversion of the Nether, where the Nether is a large cave with monsters with open space within, and the Sky Dimension is a bunch of huge floating islands surrounded by open space. Visually, it looks similar to the floating world type from Indev. Also, it looks similar to the floating worlds from the Aether mod, although I think the Indev influence is the most strong part of it.
I think maybe even you could say the Aether mod was influenced by Indev in some ways.
I think that's actually, probably the best way to think of it. And code for an early version of the Sky Dimension went unused in Beta 1.6 through Beta 1.8. And while it was planned to be part of the Adventure update, Notch delayed it because he wanted to make the Nether more fun first, which he would later do by adding Nether fortresses in Release 1.0. However, it was in Release 1.0 that the idea for the Sky Dimension was scrapped and replaced with what we know it as the End. Notch had plans to bring back the Sky Dimension after 1.0, but these plans would later be scrapped.
Like with many others.
Along with many other ideas, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. Pre-release 4 came along and replaced the Sky Dimension with the End, including most of the elements of the End that would be introduced into the final 1.0. Pre-releases 5 and 6 added some features that would end up being released in 1.0. We're sort of reaching the point where it was very similar to the end result here.
Yeah, I believe from sort of their... It was mostly like multiplayer fixes and things like that, especially in the what then came from then onwards was the 1.0 release candidates, which there were supposed to be 2, but in reality there were actually 4, which is a whole other story. As with a lot of versions at that time, there were re-uploads where the game file was changed without actually changing the name of it. And sometimes these weren't even announced. Yeah. So we do now know that there were actually 4 different release candidate clients, but there were only supposed to be 2, technically.
So then pre-release 6 added a file to the game called earlyplayers.txt, which is very interesting. It was meant to credit the first 1,000 players of the game. However, it was removed in the next version because it had some inaccuracies.
Yeah, so if you go through it today, because obviously we still have pre-release 6, I have gone through it before, not in detail, but I remember looking through it briefly, and you can see players in there that would be familiar names to anyone who's like researched old Minecraft history. So ones that we do know definitely played like early 2009, but I think the reason why it was probably removed is I don't think they kept a very good track of who was buying the game early on. I don't know which database it was based off of. I think early on it was like literally you paid to Notch's PayPal account to buy the game, so he may not have even had a proper database to start with. So I think that's probably the reason why, is it ended up being inaccurate for whatever reason, so they just didn't include it.
So then, of course, we added we move on from pre-release 6 and the various release candidates to the famous release of 1.0 that we all know, where Notch pulled down the lever at Minecon 2011, and it happened in Las Vegas, and it was finally Minecraft released to the world. Which, by the way, this is something to note here, is that this has resulted in a lot of confusion for people, somewhat surprisingly, because obviously this is called Release 1.0, so people just think, oh, Minecraft was released in November 2011, because I guess they just look at Wikipedia, and Wikipedia says Release 2011, and they just sort of forget the first 2 years of the game, which is what we've just spent this entire podcast talking about. So
yeah.
that one semantic choice ended up actually kind of making things a little bit weird for us in the archival world, but oh well, it's not a big deal, just something odd.
Yeah, and then also it's worth talking about the fact that actually wasn't, unlike popular belief, that actually technically wasn't the first Minecon, the 2011 Las Vegas one, because technically there was a kind of impromptu Minecon meetup in 2010, which actually has a lot of interesting history. And it resulted from Notch meeting up with the Gabe Newell, who works with Valve, obviously, quite a well-known guy, because at that point he was considering selling the game to Valve, or at least that's the implication. We don't really know how far the talks went or anything. It's never really been talked about very much, but obviously they were in discussion for something, maybe a release on Steam, or even just straight up selling the game, which obviously that would later on happen, but to Microsoft instead. And what happened was, Notch had to go to, I believe, Washington for that meetup to discuss with Valve, and he decided to have like an impromptu meetup with a bunch of players at the time, which became the first Minecon 2010. But it was really just in a park. It was just a bunch of people meeting up and talking, rather than an actual big convention, which the 2011 Minecon was about.
Yeah, very impromptu. You just had maybe some people dressed in creeper costumes and such.
Yeah, there's quite a famous picture, I think, from it that you can quite easily find online of someone dressed in a costume, yeah.
Yeah, very very interesting little piece of history there. Not many people know about it, and that was during the indev phase of the game.
I think it was Infdev. So it was
was it?
I believe it was in June 2010.
Oh, yeah. It was in June. Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. Yeah. So it would have been during the Infdev phase.
Or possibly
Minecraft, May. Yeah, it wasn't really
in
that
fact,
popular
I think it may
at
have
that
been
point.
May.
Oh, it was
definitely
August.
summer.
Well, it was August. See, proves us wrong. So at this point, it was starting to get a bit more popular. So that does make sense why Valve would have been interested in buying it at that point.
We're kind of coming to like the end of what we're going to talk about today, because at that point it's like we've got the release of the game that most people are familiar with, and then from then onwards, that's not the end of the story. But I would say, for like the release versions, people know what changes were around, and for the most part, there aren't many missing versions from that point onwards. There still are, which I'm sure will be mentioned in a future episode. a bit more about that. But yeah.
One interesting thing I sort of wanted to end on is the fact that we talked about those versions that were, re-uploaded without changing the actual name of the
Yes.
version, which makes them difficult to track
Very
down
difficult.
and detect.
Often they were changed very shortly after a previous release, so like sometimes minutes after. We have versions that were literally out for around, most of them were less than an hour, but we have ones that were like less than 10 minutes even, which is even surprising that we have those at all.
Mm-hmm. And I think that Mojang has still, done this fairly recently. I know that there was a re-upload for 1.16. Are there more
even
recent than
I think later than that? Yeah. I was going to say I thought that was the case. The last April Fool's update was re-uploaded, so the 1st of April 2023. So not even a year ago. So it still happens today. I think before that it was, as you said, one of the 1.16 versions. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess, if there's one thing to end the episode on to sort of wrap it up, it's that Mojang was janky in 2009, and even after Microsoft bought it, Mojang is still janky. So if there's one thing we can rely on, it's occasional jankiness, but at least I'd say things are more orderly than they used to be.
Yeah, so that's kind of mostly what we wanted to talk about today. Obviously, that's just the start of this podcast, as you mentioned. Like, there'll be many more episodes with various different people. I won't be involved in all of them, but I'll be here to listen along.
Well, we're very thankful to have you. Thank you for spending the time today to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This brings us to the end of our show. I'm Matthew Hiddleston. Our guest today was Rufus10. Our producer is Mr. Sheeple. And we'd like to extend a special thanks to Zelinator, MC4F, Zunica, and Music Bike. They were involved in the research/writing of the outline for this episode. Our next episode will be released on February 9th, so we hope you'll join us again. If you want to know more about what we do to preserve the history of Minecraft, check out our website at omniarchive.uk. Thanks for listening.